The rain falling on Julian Mitchell's mahogany casket was quiet, almost respectful, as if the weather itself knew better than to make a scene at such an expensive funeral. The cemetery in the affluent suburbs of Chicago was a sea of black cashmere and silk umbrellas. Among them stood Clara. At 32, she was the youngest widow in their elite social circle, and today she was a portrait of tragic perfection. Her dark dress was immaculate, her posture straight, her face a pale mask of composed grief. She did not weep. She had cried all her tears in the cold, sterile hospital corridor 3 days ago, when the doctor had emerged with that practiced, sympathetic tilt of the head to tell her that Julian's heart had simply, inexplicably, stopped. To the rest of the world, Julian Mitchell had been a titan of finance, a 38-year-old visionary investment banker whose sudden death was a tragedy for the markets and a devastation for his beautiful young wife. To Clara, he had been the anchor of her existence. They had been married for 5 years, a union that everyone, especially her own family, had celebrated as a modern fairy tale. Standing beside Clara under a sprawling black umbrella was her older sister, Victoria. At 36, Victoria wore her grief like a carefully selected accessory. She dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, her other hand resting heavily, almost possessively, on Clara's shoulder. Just behind them stood their parents, Richard and Margaret. Richard, with his silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes, looked less like a man burying his son-in-law and more like a CEO observing a hostile takeover. Margaret clung to her husband's arm, whispering breathless, dramatic condolences to anyone who passed by, making sure the assembled crowd saw how deeply the family was suffering. Clara felt completely numb. She let herself be guided by Victoria's firm grip, let herself be ushered into the waiting black town car, and let the monotonous hum of the tires on wet asphalt carry her back to the sprawling, silent mansion she now owned alone. The house was too large. It had always been too large. A monument to Julian's success, filled with modern art Clara didn't understand, and echoing with an emptiness she had spent 5 years trying to ignore. When the heavy front door finally clicked shut, locking the dreary afternoon outside, Clara leaned against the cool wood and closed her eyes. The silence was absolute. There were no more sympathy calls to field, no more funeral arrangements to approve. There was only the rest of her life, stretching out before her like a barren, terrifying desert. She walked slowly through the ground floor, her heels clicking softly against the Italian marble. She trailed her fingers over the back of the bespoke leather sofa, across the edge of the grand dining table where they had hosted so many brilliant, hollow dinner parties. She ended up in Julian's home office. It was a room she rarely entered. Julian had always been fiercely private about his workspace, claiming his high-stakes investment portfolios required absolute confidentiality. The room smelled faintly of his expensive cedarwood cologne. His heavy oak desk sat in the center of the room, pristine and imposing. On the corner of the desk, perfectly aligned with the edge, was his briefcase. It was a custom-made Italian leather piece, scuffed at the corners from years of international travel. The police had returned it to her from his car. Clara approached the desk. A sudden, desperate need to feel close to him washed over her. She wanted to hold something he had touched on his final day, to find some lingering trace of the man she had loved. Her trembling fingers unlatched the brass clasps. The briefcase fell open with a soft sigh. Inside, it was meticulously organized, just like Julian. Files neatly tabbed, a sleek silver pen, a leather-bound planner. Clara ran her hands over the smooth leather of the interior. As she pressed her fingers against the bottom panel, she felt something unusual. The lining shifted. It wasn't flat. There was a subtle unevenness, a slight give in the leather that shouldn't have been there. Frowning, Clara pressed harder. She slid her fingernail along the seam at the bottom corner of the case. The stitching yielded, revealing a hidden, incredibly thin compartment built directly into the base of the briefcase. Her heart gave a sudden, unexpected flutter. Julian was a man of secrets, yes, but corporate secrets. What could he possibly need to hide in a false bottom? With careful, deliberate movements, Clara pulled the false bottom up. Beneath it lay 2 items. The first was a single, heavy brass key. It looked old, lacking any branding or identifying numbers, completely unlike the sleek electronic fobs and silver keys that opened their home and cars. The second item was a small, torn piece of thick parchment paper. Written on it, in Julian's precise, elegant handwriting, was an address. It wasn't in the financial district. It wasn't a luxury condo building. It was an address in a gritty industrial neighborhood on the far south side of the city, an area Clara was certain Julian had never set foot in. She stared at the key and the paper, the numbness in her chest slowly giving way to a creeping, icy dread. A woman who discovers a hidden key in her husband's belongings usually jumps to one conclusion. Another woman. An apartment tucked away across town. A second life lived in the shadows. The thought struck Clara like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Had the late nights, the sudden business trips to London and Zurich, the quiet moments when he seemed a million miles away, all been a lie? The rational part of her brain told her to put the key back, to close the briefcase, and to mourn the perfect husband she thought she knew. But a deeper, older instinct, a quiet resilience she hadn't tapped into in years, demanded the truth. She was 32 years old, newly widowed, and suddenly entirely unsure of what her life had been for the last half-decade. She needed to know. Clara did not call Victoria. She did not call her parents. She changed out of her funeral dress, put on a pair of unassuming dark jeans and a heavy wool coat, slipped the brass key and the address into her pocket, and walked out to her car. The drive took 45 minutes, leading her further and further away from the manicured lawns and gated driveways of her world. The sky darkened into a bruised purple twilight as she navigated streets lined with rusted chain-link fences, abandoned warehouses, and flickering street lamps. She finally pulled up to a towering brutalist brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. It was a residential block, but just barely, brooding and silent against the darkening sky. Clara parked half a block away. The air was biting cold, biting through her coat as she walked toward the entrance. There was no doorman, no marble lobby, just a heavy metal door covered in layers of peeling paint and a panel of buzzer buttons, most of which were broken or missing name tags. The address on the parchment indicated apartment 4B. She pushed the heavy door open, stepping into a dimly lit hallway that smelled of damp concrete and old cooking oil. The elevator was out of order, forcing her to climb 4 flights of dimly lit concrete stairs. With every step, the pounding in her chest grew louder. What was she going to find behind that door? A woman holding a baby? A closet full of women's clothes? She reached the 4th floor. The corridor was narrow and silent. She walked slowly down the hall, counting the tarnished metal numbers on the doors. 4A, 4B. She stood before the door for a long time. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the brass key. She took a deep, shuddering breath, inserted the key into the deadbolt, and turned it. It clicked smoothly. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was pitch black. Clara reached out, her hand sliding blindly along the wall until she found a light switch. She flicked it up. Fluorescent lights buzzed to life, flooding the room in harsh, blue-white brilliance. Clara braced herself, ready for the scent of unfamiliar perfume, ready for the sight of a cozy, hidden love nest. Instead, she gasped. The apartment was not a home. It was a fortress. And a command center. There was no sofa, no television, no dining table. The hardwood floors were covered in thick, black rubber matting. Pushed against the far wall were 3 massive industrial-grade server racks, their cooling fans humming with a low, intense vibration, tiny green and red lights blinking furiously in the dimness. The center of the room was dominated by a large steel table, covered in an avalanche of paperwork, stacked ledgers, 3 separate high-end laptops, and a complex array of encrypted communication radios. It looked less like a romantic hideaway and more like the nerve center of an intelligence agency. Clara took a slow, disoriented step forward. Her eyes darted around the room. On the walls, instead of art, were large whiteboards covered in a chaotic web of handwritten notes, flowcharts, bank routing numbers, and names of shell corporations in jurisdictions she barely recognized. Belize, the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, the Seychelles. Lines connected companies to individuals, and individuals to offshore trusts. "Don't move." The voice came from the shadows near a narrow hallway leading to what should have been the bedroom. It was a male voice, young but sharp with adrenaline and fear. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. She slowly raised her hands, turning her head toward the sound. Stepping out of the darkness was a young man. He couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years old. He was tall, thin, with a mop of dark, unruly hair and eyes that were wide with panic. In his shaking hands, pointed directly at Clara's chest, was a sleek black handgun. Who are you? The young man demanded, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his youth. How did you get that key? Clara stared at the gun, then at the boy's face. As her initial terror slightly receded, she looked closer. The shape of his jaw, the deep, penetrating set of his dark eyes, the slope of his nose. The resemblance was uncanny, almost impossible, yet undeniable. It was like looking at a ghost, like looking at a phantom of the man she had just buried. Julian, Clara whispered, the name slipping from her lips like a prayer. The boy flinched as if she had struck him. His grip on the gun tightened. Don't say his name. Who the hell are you? Clara swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. My name is Clara Mitchell. I was Julian's wife. The boy stared at her, his expression shifting from terror to profound confusion, and then, slowly, to a look of bitter, mocking disbelief. He lowered the gun slightly, though he didn't put it away. You're the wife, he said, a harsh laugh escaping his lips. The perfect, oblivious wife. The cover story. What are you talking about? Clara demanded, a sudden, fierce anger piercing through her fear. Who are you? What is this place? The boy stepped fully into the light. He looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with dark circles, his clothes rumpled as if he had been sleeping in them for days. My name is Leo, he said. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and resentment. And Julian Mitchell wasn't just your husband. He was my father. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights grew deafening. Clara reached out, grabbing the edge of the steel table to steady herself. You're a father. Julian didn't have children. We didn't have children. He was 38. He had a life before you, Leo said coldly. He had my mother, and he had me. He kept us hidden because we didn't fit into the pristine corporate image he needed to build. Clara shook her head, unable to process the words. No, that's impossible. I would have known. His family, Victoria, my parents, they would have known. Leo let out a sharp, ugly sound. He finally clicked the safety back on the handgun and tossed it onto the steel table with a heavy thud. He walked over to one of the whiteboards, grabbing a dry erase marker. You really don't know anything, do you? Leo said, turning back to face her. You think Julian was just a hotshot investment banker making smart trades on Wall Street? He gestured wildly around the room, at the servers, the ledgers, the offshore routing numbers. Look around you, Clara. Does this look like standard corporate finance to you? Clara looked at the boards. She saw columns of numbers in the tens of millions. She saw words like layering, integration, crypto tumbling. What is this? She asked, her voice a hollow whisper. It's a laundry, Leo said bluntly. My father was an architect, but he didn't build buildings. He built shadow economies. He took dirty money, cartel money, human trafficking money, illegal arms money, and he made it clean. He built a labyrinth of shell companies so deep and so complex that the feds couldn't even find the front door, let alone the vault. Julian Mitchell was one of the most prolific money launderers on the eastern seaboard. Clara stumbled backward, collapsing into a cheap folding chair in the corner of the room. The air felt too thin to breathe. Her husband, the man who brought her coffee in bed, who meticulously planned their anniversaries in Tuscany, who spoke softly and wore bespoke suits. A criminal, a shadow broker for monsters. Why are you here, Leo? She asked, looking up at the boy who was suddenly the only anchor in a world that had just been torn to shreds. If he kept you a secret, why are you in his safe house? Leo's face darkened, a flash of genuine sorrow crossing his youthful features. Because he knew it was falling apart. He called me 4 days ago, told me to come here, to lock the door and not let anyone in unless they had the brass key. He said the walls were closing in, that he had lost $50 million of someone else's money, and that they were coming for him. Leo swallowed hard, his eyes shining with unshed tears. And then, a day later, he has a sudden, fatal heart attack? Leo scoffed. My father was the healthiest man I knew. His heart didn't stop, Clara. It was stopped. Murder. The word hung in the air, unspoken but screaming in Clara's mind. He left me a message, Leo continued, walking over to one of the laptops. He tapped the spacebar, waking the machine up. A complex password-protected interface filled the screen. He said if anything happened to him, I had to find the wife. He said she was the key. Clara stared at him. Me? Why me? I don't know anything about any of this. He said you had the access, Leo said, his fingers flying across the keyboard, entering a long string of commands. He said he hid the failsafes in plain sight, under your name. My name? Clara stood up, a new wave of panic rising in her chest. She walked over to the laptop, looking over Leo's shoulder. Leo brought up a secure directory, opening a file labeled Offshore Holdings, Active. Rows and rows of bank accounts filled the screen. Accounts in Switzerland, the Bahamas, the Cook Islands, and next to each account, listed as the primary beneficiary and sole authorized signatory, was a name, Clara Elizabeth Mitchell. Oh my God, Clara breathed, pressing a hand to her mouth. He didn't just hide behind you, Clara, Leo said, his voice grim. He weaponized your innocence. He put the entire illicit empire in your name, to the IRS, to the FBI, to the people he stole from. You are the ghost. You are the one holding the purse strings. Clara felt a physical sickness twist in her stomach. She thought back to the dozens of times Julian had placed thick stacks of paperwork in front of her at the breakfast table. Just standard tax filings, darling. Routine wealth management updates. Sign here, here, and here. She had signed them without a second thought. She trusted him implicitly. She trusted her father, who had introduced them, who had vouched for Julian's immaculate character. Wait, Clara said, a sudden chilling thought slicing through her panic. The $50 million, the money he lost. Who did it belong to? Leo didn't look up from the screen. A man named Marcus Thorne. He represents a syndicate out of Eastern Europe. They aren't the kind of people who sue you when you lose their money. They're the kind of people who dismantle your life piece by piece until they get what they want. And if my name is on these accounts, Clara started, the terrifying reality dawning on her. Then Marcus Thorne is going to come looking for you, Leo finished, finally looking up at her. He thinks you have his money, or at the very least, he thinks you know how to get it. Clara backed away from the desk, her mind spinning wildly. The perfect funeral, the tears, the condolences. It had all been a play, a stage-managed performance while a ticking time bomb sat perfectly concealed in the center of her life. We have to go to the police, Clara said, her voice trembling but gaining volume. We have to go to the FBI. We tell them everything. We show them this room. Are you insane? Leo hissed, jumping out of his chair. If you go to the feds, they'll lock you up for 50 years. Your signature is on billions of dollars of laundered funds. You think they're going to believe the clueless wife routine? And even if they did, Thorne's people have eyes everywhere. You wouldn't make it to a witness protection safe house before they put a bullet in your head. Clara felt cornered, a rat trapped in a maze she hadn't even known she was running in. Then what do we do? I don't know the passwords. I don't know where the $50 million went. I'm trying to figure that out, Leo said, turning back to the monitors. Julian left breadcrumbs, a ledger that doesn't match the digital files. He was moving the money somewhere safe, somewhere off the grid before they got to him. I just need time to crack his encryption. Clara stood in the center of the fluorescent-lit bunker, surrounded by the physical evidence of her ruined life. She thought of her immaculate house. She thought of her sister, Victoria, dabbing her dry eyes. She thought of her parents. I need to look at the transfer logs, Clara said suddenly, her voice hardening. A strange, cold clarity began to settle over her. The shock was burning away, leaving behind a sharp, focused anger. If she was going down, she needed to know exactly who was dragging her. Leo looked at her, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. He hesitated, then clicked a few buttons, bringing up a massive spreadsheet filled with dates, routing numbers, and amounts. These are the outbound transfers from the primary holding shell for the last 12 months. It's how Julian paid his network. Bribes, hush money, operational costs. Clara leaned close to the screen. She didn't understand the complex financial jargon, but she understood names. She understood bank routing numbers from the domestic accounts she managed for household expenses. She scanned the lines. Thousands of transactions. Then her eyes snagged on a recurring series of transfers. Date, the first of every month. Amount, $250,000. Destination, a private wealth management trust at First Republic Bank. Clara knew that trust. She knew the routing number by heart. It was the trust established by her father, Richard. Her breath hitched. She scrolled down frantically. Another recurring transfer. Every quarter, $500,000. Destination, Victoria's boutique PR firm, listed under consulting fees. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath Clara's feet. The numbers blurred, swimming before her eyes. It wasn't just Julian. He hadn't fooled them. He hadn't pulled the wool over her family's eyes. They knew. Her father, the respectable patriarch. Her mother, the socialite. Her sister, her closest confidant. They all knew exactly who Julian Mitchell was. They hadn't just tolerated his criminal empire. They had profited from it. They had actively taken the blood money. And they had served her up on a silver platter. They had introduced her to Julian, encouraged the marriage, pushed her down the aisle into the arms of a cartel money launderer, all to secure their own financial pipeline. They had used her as a human shield, wrapping her in a facade of domestic bliss while they quietly bled millions from the underworld. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, it felt physical. It felt like being buried alive by the people who had given her life. Clara stepped back from the computer. The panic that had been suffocating her suddenly vanished, replaced by an emotion so cold, so dark and precise, it frightened her. The naive, 32-year-old grieving widow had died in that hospital corridor alongside her husband. The woman standing in the basement server room was someone else entirely. "Leo," Clara said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Print those logs. Print every single transfer that goes to my maiden name. To my parents. To my sister." Leo looked at her, sensing the terrifying shift in the atmosphere. "You know these accounts?" "They belong to my family," Clara said, her eyes locked on the glowing screen. "They sold me." She looked around the room, the ledgers, the servers, the empire of lies built on her back. The world thought she was a fragile widow holding an empty bag. They were wrong. She was holding the detonator. "Keep working on the 50 million, Clara instructed the boy, her tone shifting from a frightened victim to a commanding presence. "Crack the encryption. Find out where he hid the real money. I need to go home." "Home?" Leo asked, incredulous. "You can't go back there. If Thorne's people are watching—" "Let them watch," Clara said, turning toward the heavy metal door. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, her posture straightening, a terrifying, beautiful resolve settling into her bones. "I have a family dinner to attend, and it's time I finally learned how to play the family business." The drive to her parents' estate in Lake Forest felt like a journey to a different dimension. For 32 years, Clara had viewed the sprawling Tudor-style mansion as a sanctuary. It was the place of her childhood Christmases, summer garden parties, and the warm, suffocating embrace of a family that had always insisted on absolute loyalty. Tonight, as her tires crunched over the pristine white gravel of the circular driveway, the house looked different. The warm yellow light spilling from the leaded glass windows didn't look inviting. It looked predatory. It was a well-lit trap. Clara sat in her car for 3 full minutes, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She closed her eyes, practicing her breathing, forcing the jagged edges of her rage into a tight, locked box deep within her chest. She could not walk in there as a woman who had just discovered her family's sociopathic betrayal. She had to walk in as the woman they expected, the fragile, grieving, utterly dependent widow. When she finally stepped through the heavy oak front doors, the performance began. "Oh, my sweet, brave girl," her mother, Margaret, cooed, sweeping across the foyer in a swirl of cashmere and expensive gardenia perfume. Margaret wrapped her arms around Clara, pulling her into a tight embrace. Clara forced her muscles to relax, resting her chin on her mother's shoulder. She inhaled the familiar scent, a scent she now knew was bought and paid for by human trafficking and cartel blood money. It took every ounce of her willpower not to physically recoil. "I'm all right, Mom. Just tired," Clara murmured, her voice appropriately soft and wavering. "Of course you are, darling," her father, Richard, said as he emerged from his study. He was a tall, imposing man, carrying a crystal tumbler of single malt scotch. He looked at Clara with an expression of deep paternal concern, his silver hair catching the light of the chandelier. "You've been through hell, but you are not alone. We are going to handle everything." Victoria, her older sister, leaned against the archway leading to the formal dining room, swirling a glass of red wine. "We ordered from that Italian place Julian loved," Victoria said, her tone casually sympathetic. Thought you could use some comfort food, though I doubt you have much of an appetite. Thank you, Vicky, Clara said, using her childhood nickname for her sister. She looked at Victoria, at her flawless makeup, her designer silk blouse, the subtle gleam of a diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. $500,000 a quarter, Clara thought, her mind flashing back to the ledger in the underground bunker. That's what it costs to buy a sister's soul. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. They sat around the antique mahogany table, eating perfectly seared scallops and creamy risotto. Margaret dominated the conversation, steering it toward trivial gossip about their country club friends, a deliberate, orchestrated attempt to create a sense of normalcy. Clara played her part flawlessly. She picked at her food, offered sad, vacant smiles, and let a single, well-timed tear escape when Richard raised his glass in a quiet toast to Julian's memory. It wasn't until the plates were cleared and the heavy silver coffee service was brought out that the real agenda of the evening was revealed. Richard cleared his throat, setting his coffee cup down with a deliberate clink. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the faux warmth evaporating into a tense, calculated silence. "Clara, sweetheart," Richard began, his voice taking on the smooth, authoritative cadence he used in boardrooms. "I know this is the last thing you want to think about right now, but Julian's sudden passing has left a rather complicated financial landscape." Clara looked up, her eyes wide and perfectly confused. "Complicated? But Julian handled all of our money. He said we were secure. He said everything was in trust." Victoria exchanged a swift, meaningful glance with their father. "Julian was brilliant, Clara," Victoria said, leaning forward, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. "But he was also a risk-taker. Dad has been looking into the preliminary estate documents. It seems Julian made some highly leveraged investments right before he died. Things are messy. The IRS might get involved. There could be audits." "Audits?" Clara gasped, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They weren't worried about the IRS. They were terrified that the criminal syndicate Julian was laundering for would trace the missing $50 million back to the family's front door. They needed to insulate themselves, and they needed Clara to hand over the keys. Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He slid it slowly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of Clara's plate. "We want to protect you, Clara," her father said, his eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity. "You shouldn't have to deal with lawyers, tax agents, and aggressive creditors while you're mourning. This is a comprehensive power of attorney, along with a transfer of control for the offshore holding companies Julian listed in your name." Clara stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "My name? Why are there offshore companies in my name?" "Julian was shielding his assets," Margaret chimed in quickly, patting Clara's hand across the table. "He meant well, darling, but it's dangerous for you to hold them now. If the market regulators come knocking, they will come after you. Your father and Victoria have the legal teams to absorb this. You just need to sign, and we will take the entire burden off your shoulders." It was brilliant, Clara had to admit. It was a perfectly designed emotional trap. They were using her grief and her manufactured ignorance to rob her of the only leverage she had, all while masquerading as her saviors. If she signed those papers, they would have absolute control over the entire money laundering apparatus. They could siphon off the remaining funds, pay off the syndicate, and leave Clara with nothing but the legal liability if the federal government ever found out. Clara let her lower lip tremble. She reached out and touched the edge of the envelope, then quickly pulled her hand back as if burned. I can't," she whispered, letting a tear spill down her cheek. "It's too much. It's too soon. I just buried my husband today. Please, Dad, don't make me read legal jargon tonight. My head is pounding." Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly. A flash of irritation crossed Victoria's face, but she quickly masked it. "Of course, darling. I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice softening, though his eyes remained hard and calculating. "I shouldn't have pushed. Take the envelope home. Take a day or two. But Clara, please understand, time is of the essence here. The longer those accounts sit in your name, the more danger you are in." "I understand," Clara said softly, slipping the envelope into her purse. "I'll look at it tomorrow. I promise." She left the house 20 minutes later, enduring another round of suffocating hugs and whispered promises of protection. When she finally got back into her car and the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate closed behind her, Clara let out a long, ragged exhale. The mask dropped. Her hands stopped trembling. She reached into her purse, pulled out the thick envelope, and tossed it onto the passenger seat with a look of pure disgust. She didn't drive back to her empty, echoing mansion. She drove straight back to the industrial district, back to the hidden concrete bunker where her husband's secret son was waiting. When Clara unlocked the heavy metal door to apartment 4B, the air inside was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt coffee. Leo was exactly where she had left him, hunched over the glowing monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboards. He looked exhausted, but there was a frantic, feverish energy about him. "You're back," Leo said, not looking up. "How was the Addams family dinner?" "Educational," Clara replied dryly, throwing her coat onto the folding chair. She dropped the manila envelope onto the steel table. "They want me to sign over full power of attorney. They're terrified. They mentioned aggressive creditors." Leo finally stopped typing and spun his chair around. "They have a good reason to be terrified. I found out what happened to the missing $50 million. Clara stepped closer to the monitors. "Where is it?" "It's not where," Leo corrected, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's what. Julian didn't lose the money in a bad trade, and he didn't steal it to buy an island. He weaponized it." Leo tapped a key, and a complex graph filled the center screen. It looked like a heartbeat monitor gone mad, filled with jagged red and green candlesticks. Julian knew Marcus Thorne and his Eastern European bosses were getting paranoid. They were going to clean house, and Julian knew he was on the chopping block. So 2 weeks ago, Julian took their $50 million and threw it into the foreign exchange market, specifically the EUR/USD pair. Clara frowned. "He gambled it on currencies?" "He didn't gamble. He built a trap," Leo explained, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror at his late father's audacity. He used a massive margin multiplier. He essentially bet against the euro with extreme leverage, but he locked the funds in a dark pool smart contract. He told Thorne the money was temporarily tied up in a liquidity audit to dodge the IRS. But the truth is, Julian tied that $50 million to a dead man's switch. "Speak English, Leo," Clara demanded, her patience wearing thin. If Julian didn't log into the system and enter a specific cryptographic key every 48 hours, the smart contract was programmed to automatically execute a catastrophic short sell, Leo said, pointing to the screen. "Julian missed his check-in because he died. The switch activated yesterday morning. That $50 million isn't sitting in a bank account waiting to be withdrawn. It's currently holding up a massive, incredibly fragile position in the global market. And it's bleeding out. Fast." Clara stared at the jagged lines on the screen, the reality of the situation sinking in. "So the money is gone?" "Not yet, but it's locked. And here is the genius part," Leo said, swallowing hard. "The account holding that leveraged position? The one that is about to default and trigger a massive investigation by international banking authorities? It's registered under a shell company owned exclusively by your father, Richard." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Julian hadn't just been laundering money for her family. He had secretly tied the noose around their necks. He knew they would try to steal the empire if he died, so he made sure the empire was a ticking time bomb. If Marcus Thorne came looking for his money, the digital trail wouldn't lead to Clara. It would lead directly to Richard and Victoria. "Julian framed them," Clara whispered, a dark, vindictive thrill shooting down her spine. "He didn't frame them. He just stepped out of the way and let them hold the bag," Leo said. Then his expression darkened. He reached across the desk and picked up a pair of heavy studio headphones. "But there's something else. Something worse." Clara felt the temperature in the room drop. Worse than $50 million of cartel money? Leo's hands trembled slightly as he held the headphones out to her. "While I was digging through the core server, I found a hidden encrypted partition. It wasn't financial data. It was audio files, voice memos. Julian was keeping a diary." Clara hesitated, staring at the headphones. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear her dead husband's voice. She wasn't sure her fractured heart could take another hit. But she took them anyway, slipping them over her ears. Leo clicked a file on the screen. There was a hiss of static, and then Julian's voice filled her ears. It sounded rough, exhausted, and desperately sad. "File 402, October 12th. Julian's recorded voice echoed in the dark space of her mind. "Thorne is getting suspicious about the Chicago routing. I have to move the servers again. God, I'm so tired. I look at Clara sleeping and I wonder if she'll ever know what it took to build this cage we live in. Clara closed her eyes. Even in his secret recordings, he spoke of her like a pet, like a fragile bird he had to keep locked away. Richard pushed another $10 million through Victoria's firm today. The recording continued, Julian's voice dripping with bitter resentment. The old man is getting greedy. He thinks he holds the leash because of what happened in 2018. He thinks I'll play the loyal son-in-law forever because he has the leverage. A heavy pause followed on the recording. The sound of ice clinking against glass. Julian taking a drink. Leo asked about his mother again today. Julian's voice cracked slightly. He asked why the police never found the driver who ran her off the road. I lied to him. Again, how do you tell a 12-year-old boy that his mother didn't die in a random accident? Clara's eyes snapped open. She stared at Leo, who was watching her with an expression of pure, unadulterated agony. How do I tell my son? Julian's voice continued, a heavy, suffocating weight behind every word. That I found the mechanic? That I paid the man to tell me the truth? It wasn't an accident. The brake lines were severed, and the wire transfer that paid the mechanic came from an offshore account controlled by Victoria Mitchell. Clara gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. The sound was ripped from her throat, a visceral reaction to pure evil. Richard and Victoria, Julian whispered into the microphone, sounding like a defeated, broken man. They knew I wanted out of their money laundering ring. They knew I was going to take Sarah and Leo and disappear, so they killed her. They murdered my wife, and then Richard cornered me. He told me if I didn't marry Clara, if I didn't cement the family ties and keep the money flowing, Leo would be next. I sold my soul to keep my son alive, and I ruined Clara's life in the process. The recording clicked off, leaving nothing but the hiss of static. Clara slowly pulled the headphones off, letting them drop to the floor with a clatter. The silence in the bunker was deafening. She looked at Leo. Tears were streaming silently down the young man's face. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bruised. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, violent force. Her family wasn't just a group of white-collar criminals who had used her for financial gain. They were monsters. Her elegant, refined mother who hosted charity galas. Her distinguished, authoritative father. Her sophisticated, supportive sister. They were murderers. They had slaughtered a woman to secure a financial asset, and then they had offered Clara up as a human sacrifice to keep the money clean. Every smile, every birthday gift, every word of comfort at the funeral, it was all a grotesque, sociopathic performance. Clara turned away from Leo, walking slowly toward the concrete wall. She placed her hands flat against the cold surface, resting her forehead against the stone. She thought she had known anger. When she found out about the money laundering, she was furious. When she realized her family was using her, she was enraged. But this was different. This wasn't a fire that burned hot and fast. This was liquid nitrogen. It was a cold, absolute zero that froze every ounce of fear, every ounce of grief, and every ounce of mercy left in her body. Clara? Leo asked, his voice thick with emotion. What do we do? Clara pushed herself off the wall. When she turned back to face the glowing monitors, her eyes were completely dry. The beautiful, naive widow who had stood weeping at the cemetery was gone forever. The woman standing in the bunker was the architect of their destruction. We don't go to the police, Clara said, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with a terrifying absolute authority. The justice system would take years. They would hire the best lawyers, drag it out, maybe even buy a judge. A prison sentence is too good for them. She walked over to the desk, picking up the manila envelope her father had given her, the power of attorney documents. She stared at it, a dark, lethal smile slowly spreading across her lips. They want control of the empire? Clara said, tossing the envelope onto the keyboard. Fine. We are going to give it to them. We are going to sign over every single account. We are going to give them the keys to the kingdom. Leo wiped his eyes, staring at her in confusion. But if you do that, you give them the $50 million trap. You hand them over to Marcus Thorne. Exactly, Clara said, her eyes gleaming with a cold, unforgiving light. She leaned over the desk, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the jagged red lines of the Forex graph. My father and my sister think they are playing chess. They think they have me cornered. But Julian left us the perfect weapon. We are going to activate the rest of the margin traps. We are going to drain their legitimate accounts to feed the failing offshore positions. Clara looked at the 18-year-old boy who had lost his mother to her family's greed. They took your mother, Leo. They stole my life. They wanted to swim with the sharks to get rich. So we are going to chum the water, tie the bloody meat around their necks, and push them in. The bunker felt colder as the night dragged on, the hum of the server racks providing a relentless, mechanical soundtrack to their grim work. Clara and Leo sat side by side at the steel table, a bizarre alliance forged in the fires of a shared betrayal. Spread out before them were Julian's leather-bound trading journals, filled with complex charts, handwritten notes, and precise mathematical calculations. If Clara was going to hand her family the keys to an exploding financial empire, she needed to understand exactly how the bomb worked. Julian didn't just throw $50 million blindly at the market, Leo explained, tracing a finger along a jagged, hand-drawn chart in the journal. He traded using price action. He didn't rely on delayed indicators or algorithms. He read the raw psychology of the market. Look here. Leo pointed to a specific zone marked with heavy red ink. This is a major resistance level on the EUR/USD weekly chart. The market has been testing this ceiling for months. Clara leaned in, her sharp mind quickly absorbing the data. So he anticipated a breakout? No, he anticipated a fake-out, Leo corrected, a hint of dark admiration in his voice. A liquidity grab. He knew the big institutional banks would push the price just above that resistance line to trigger all the retail stop losses, gathering enough liquidity before aggressively dumping the price in the opposite direction. Julian placed the $50 million right at the peak of that false breakout, using a 1-to-100 leverage multiplier. Clara did the math in her head, her breath catching. He leveraged it to $5 billion. Exactly, Leo said grimly. He took a massive short position against the euro. If the price drops like he predicted, the account makes a fortune. But if the euro keeps climbing, even by a few fractions of a cent, the margin call will wipe out the original $50 million in minutes. And right now, the euro is climbing. It's inching closer to the liquidation price every hour. But Julian is dead, Clara said, her eyes locked on the glowing screens. He can't manage the trade. He can't inject more capital to save the position. He never intended to save it, Leo replied, looking up at her. He set the account up under your father's shell company, but he locked the execution controls behind a digital dead man's switch. Since Julian didn't enter his passcode, the system froze the assets. The money is trapped in the market, bleeding out, and the syndicate is going to come looking for whoever holds the legal title to that specific offshore holding. Clara picked up the thick manila envelope containing the power of attorney documents her father had given her. And once I sign this, legal title transfers entirely to Richard and Victoria. Yes, Leo said. But the timing has to be flawless. We have to give them the accounts right before the margin call hits. If we give it to them too early, Richard's financial team might realize the trap and liquidate the position at a partial loss, saving themselves. If we give it to them too late, the account wipes out while your name is still technically on the master ledger, and Marcus Thorne comes for you. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing electronic ring shattered the quiet of the bunker. Both Clara and Leo jumped. The sound wasn't coming from Clara's purse. It was coming from a locked metal drawer in Julian's desk. Leo grabbed a crowbar from the corner of the room and pried the drawer open, revealing a cheap, disposable burner phone vibrating violently against the steel. The caller ID was blocked. Leo looked at Clara, his face pale. It's him. It has to be Thorne. Clara stared at the buzzing piece of plastic. This was the monster her husband had worked for, the man who could have her killed with a single phone call. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to smash the phone and disappear. But the cold, calculating woman she had become in the last 3 hours overrode her fear. If she wanted to destroy her family, she needed the monster. She picked up the phone and pressed the green button. She didn't say a word. For a moment, there was only the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing on the other end of the line. Then a voice spoke. It was deep, textured with a thick Eastern European accent, and completely devoid of emotion. Julian is dead, the voice said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Clara answered, keeping her voice perfectly steady. I am speaking to the wife. You are? My condolences, Marcus Thorne said, the words sounding like a threat. Your husband was a very talented man. Unfortunately, his sudden departure has caused a severe disruption in my operations. He was holding $50 million of my capital. The routing numbers point to a holding company where you are listed as the primary signatory. I want my money, Mrs. Mitchell. The money is safe, Clara lied smoothly, her eyes meeting Leo's terrified gaze. Julian anticipated interference. He put the funds into a highly leveraged protective trust to avoid federal scrutiny following his accident. I do not care about federal scrutiny, Thorne replied, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. I care about my capital. You have 48 hours to unfreeze the routing protocols and return the funds. If the money is not in my designated accounts by Friday evening, I will not send lawyers to your beautiful home in Lake Forest. I will send men. They will not ask questions. Do you understand? I understand perfectly, Mr. Thorne, Clara said, her grip on the phone tightening. But I am not the one you need to worry about. I am merely a proxy. The actual managers of the trust, the ones who hold the ultimate executive power over the funds, are my family, Richard Mitchell and Victoria Mitchell. There was a pause on the line. Clara could hear the faint click of a keyboard in the background. Thorne was checking the names. I am signing over full legal and operational control of the entire offshore apparatus to them tomorrow night, Clara continued, her voice dripping with artificial innocence. They are much more experienced in these financial matters than I am. They have assured me they will handle all outstanding obligations. Richard and Victoria, Thorne repeated, the names tasting like ash in his mouth. Very well. If the legal transfer is complete, the debt transfers with it. Tell your father and your sister they have 48 hours, or they will pay with their lives. The line went dead. Clara slowly lowered the phone. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but a dark, triumphant smile touched the corners of her mouth. She had just painted a massive, glowing target on the backs of the people who had murdered her husband's first wife. He bought it, Clara whispered. He's going to slaughter them, Leo said, his voice a mixture of horror and vindication. Only if the market doesn't destroy them first, Clara corrected. She turned back to the price action charts, studying the relentless upward crawl of the euro. We need to prepare the transfer. I'm going back to the estate tomorrow evening. I'll give them exactly what they want. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological preparation. Clara returned to her empty mansion and spent the day destroying any trace of her true intentions. She packed a single, unassuming suitcase with her most practical clothes. She wiped her personal computer. She withdrew a modest amount of cash from her legitimate checking account. Just enough to survive, not enough to trigger banking alerts. When the sun began to dip below the Chicago skyline, casting long, bleeding shadows across the manicured lawns, Clara dressed for her final performance. She chose a gray, shapeless cashmere sweater and simple trousers. She applied no makeup, allowing the dark circles under her eyes to show prominently. She wanted to look broken. She needed them to see a weak, terrified widow, desperate to be saved. She arrived at the Lake Forest estate at exactly 7 o'clock. The atmosphere in her parents' home was starkly different from the night before. The pretense of warmth had evaporated. There was no smell of Italian food, no gentle classical music playing in the background. The grand foyer felt like a tribunal. Richard was waiting for her in his study, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk that looked more like a judge's bench. Victoria stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, her designer stilettos tapping impatiently against the marble hearth. Margaret sat on a leather sofa, sipping a gin and tonic, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and her oldest daughter. Clara, Richard said, not standing up to greet her. His tone was brisk, all business. Come in. Close the doors. Clara did as she was told, keeping her head bowed, her shoulders slumped. She clutched her leather purse to her chest like a shield. She walked slowly to one of the wingback chairs facing her father's desk and sat on the very edge of the cushion. You look awful, darling, Margaret offered from the sofa, though there was no real sympathy in her voice. Have you been sleeping? Not really, Clara whispered, her voice wavering perfectly. She looked at her father. I brought the papers. Richard's eyes gleamed with a hungry, predatory light. He extended his hand. Good girl. I have our corporate notary waiting in the library. Once you sign, we can immediately begin insulating the estate. We've had our analysts looking at Julian's recent maneuvers. It's worse than we thought. Worse? Clara asked, her voice trembling. What do you mean? Victoria scoffed, walking over to the desk and pouring herself a drink from a crystal decanter. Julian was a reckless idiot, Clara. He leveraged everything. He was hiding money from his own clients. Dangerous clients. If you don't sign that power of attorney right now, You are going to wake up tomorrow with the federal government seizing your house and God knows who else knocking on your door to collect. We are doing this to save you, Clara, Richard added, his voice smooth, reasonable, and utterly lethal. We are absorbing the risk. We will take the brunt of the legal fallout, manage the creditors, and ensure that you walk away clean. But you have to trust us. You have to surrender control. Clara looked at the three of them. Her father, the architect of a murder. Her sister, the jealous, greedy accomplice. Her mother, the silent, complicit enabler. They were looking at her not as a daughter or a sister, but as a minor obstacle standing between them and a billion-dollar criminal empire. She let a single tear slip down her cheek. She let her breathing become shallow and panicked. I don't understand any of this, Clara sobbed, burying her face in her hands. It wasn't entirely acting. The sheer weight of their betrayal was enough to make her stomach churn. I just want it to be over. I want Julian back. I don't want to deal with lawyers or creditors or any of it. Then sign the damn papers, Clara, Victoria snapped, losing the last shred of her manufactured patience. Stop crying and be an adult. We are trying to clean up your mess. Richard shot Victoria a warning glare, then pushed a silver fountain pen across the desk toward Clara. Just sign, sweetheart, and it will all go away. Clara reached out with a trembling hand. She picked up the pen. It felt heavy, cold, and immensely powerful. She pulled the thick stack of legal documents from her purse and laid them flat on the mahogany desk. She didn't read them. She already knew exactly what they said. With a shaky, cursive script, she signed her name on the dotted line. Clara Elizabeth Mitchell. She signed the transfer of the holding companies. She signed the relinquishment of the offshore trusts. She signed the absolute, irrevocable power of attorney over to Richard and Victoria Mitchell. With every stroke of the pen, she wasn't signing away her life. She was signing their death warrants. As she finished the final signature, the heavy oak doors of the study opened. A man in a sharp gray suit walked in. Richard's personal notary. He wordlessly collected the documents, stamped them with his official seal, and slipped them into a leather briefcase. It's done, Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair. The tension in his shoulders vanished, replaced by an aura of absolute, arrogant victory. He looked at Victoria, sharing a brief, triumphant smirk. They had won. They had the empire. Clara slumped back in her chair, wiping her eyes with a tissue. So, what happens now? Do I need to speak to the lawyers? The atmosphere in this room instantly turned ice cold. No, Clara, Victoria said, her voice dropping the facade of sisterly concern entirely. She set her drink down and looked down at Clara with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. You don't need to speak to anyone. In fact, you don't need to do anything at all. Clara looked up, feigning confusion. What do you mean? Richard folded his hands on the desk. The paternal warmth was completely gone, replaced by the ruthless calculation of a corporate raider. Julian left behind a massive amount of debt, Clara. Millions in liabilities. To protect the family's core assets, we are going to have to liquidate everything associated with his name. That includes the mansion. Clara gasped. My house? But where will I go? That's entirely up to you, Victoria said with a cruel, dismissive wave of her hand. We've already arranged for a moving company to box up your personal belongings. They'll be put in storage. The locks on the mansion are being changed as we speak. You're throwing me out? Clara asked, her voice cracking. Tonight? We are managing a crisis, Clara. Margaret finally spoke up from the sofa, refusing to meet her daughter's eyes. It's best if you step away, go stay at a hotel, take a vacation. Let the professionals handle the fallout. It was breathtaking. The speed with which they discarded her. The moment she was no longer legally useful, the moment she had surrendered the keys to the vault, they didn't just push her aside, they erased her. They were leaving a 32-year-old widow homeless on the streets of Chicago, 48 hours after her husband's funeral. Clara stood up slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't scream or beg. She looked at her father, then at her mother, and finally at her sister. I understand, Clara said softly, picking up her purse. It's for the best, Richard said, turning his attention to his computer screen, already dismissing her existence. Close the door on your way out. Clara walked out of the study, through the grand foyer, and out the heavy front doors into the biting Chicago night. The cold air hit her face, but she didn't shiver. She walked down the long driveway toward her car. When she was finally out of sight of the mansion, enveloped by the darkness of the tree-lined street, Clara stopped. She looked back at the glowing windows of the estate. They were inside, probably breaking open a bottle of vintage champagne, celebrating their brilliant coup. They thought they had just inherited the world. They had no idea they had just swallowed a grenade. Clara unlocked her car, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled out her cell phone. She dialed a number she had memorized from the bunker. "Leo," Clara said, her voice no longer trembling. It was smooth, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. "Did it work?" Leo asked, the tension clear in his voice. "The ink is dry," Clara smiled in the dark. "They took it all. The legal transfer is complete and notarized. Richard and Victoria are now the sole proprietors of the EUR/USD margin account." Clara started the engine, the headlights slicing through the darkness. "Good," Leo said, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. "Because the euro just spiked. The market is reversing, Clara. The resistance level held, and the institutional algorithms are dumping the price. The margin call is going to hit the account in less than 12 hours. Let it burn," Clara said quietly. "Activate the dead man's switch. Send the ledgers to the IRS. And Leo?" "Yeah?" "Send a copy of the notarized transfer documents directly to Marcus Thorne," Clara instructed, shifting the car into drive. "Let him know exactly whose door he needs to kick down." The morning sun rose over the manicured lawns of the Lake Forest estate, casting a golden, deceitful glow over the stone facade. Inside the grand dining room, the atmosphere was thick with the intoxicating scent of absolute victory. Richard Mitchell sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a crisp silk robe, a cup of freshly brewed espresso in one hand and a sleek tablet in the other. Across from him sat Victoria, scrolling through her phone with a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. Margaret was in the conservatory, softly humming to herself as she arranged imported orchids. They had done it. They had surgically removed Clara from the equation, taking complete legal control of Julian's hidden empire without spilling a single drop of their own blood. The notarized power of attorney was safely locked in Richard's wall safe. According to their preliminary estimates, they were now sitting on over $50 million in untraceable cartel capital, a sum they fully intended to launder through Victoria's PR firm over the next 5 years, completely insulating themselves from Marcus Thorne and the Eastern European syndicate. They thought Clara was currently sobbing in a cheap motel room, broken, penniless, and utterly defeated. "The offshore holding companies have officially registered the transfer of ownership," Richard announced, his voice a low purr of satisfaction as he tapped the screen of his tablet. "We are now the sole signatories of the primary liquidity accounts in Cyprus and Belize. Julian's digital fingerprints are being wiped as we speak." "What about Thorne?" Victoria asked, not looking up from her phone. She was already browsing listings for a vacation home in the Hamptons. "He expects his $50 million by tomorrow evening." "Thorne is a thug," Richard dismissed with a wave of his hand. "I'll have my lawyers draft a structured repayment plan. We'll trickle a few million back to him to keep the dogs at bay, tell him the rest is tied up in federal probate. By the time he realizes we're stringing him along, the money will be completely untraceable, and we'll have enough private security to start our own small country." Richard tapped another icon on his tablet, opening the secure banking portal to view the crown jewel of their new empire, the primary holding account where Julian had parked the syndicate's $50 million. He entered the newly generated passwords. The screen loaded. Richard frowned. He blinked, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing his eyes before looking at the screen again. "Victoria," Richard said, his voice suddenly losing its arrogant timbre. "Bring your laptop in here. Now." Victoria sighed, annoyed by the interruption, but the sheer panic bleeding into her father's voice made her pause. She grabbed her silver laptop from the sideboard and brought it to the table, flipping it open. "Log into the master ledger," Richard ordered, his face draining of color. "Tell me what you see under the cypress holding shell." Victoria typed rapidly, her manicured nails clacking against the keys. The screen verified her credentials and opened the dashboard. She stared at the numbers. "Dad," Victoria whispered, her breath catching in her throat. This isn't a cash holding account, it's a brokerage portal. It's a foreign exchange margin account." "I know what it is," Richard snapped, his hands beginning to tremble. "Look at the balance. Look at the positions." Victoria's eyes darted across the screen, trying to make sense of the jagged red lines and the violently flashing alerts. Julian didn't park the $50 million. He entered a trade. He shorted the euro with a 100-to-1 leverage multiplier. He bet $5 billion against the market. "And the market is rallying," Richard choked out, a cold, paralyzing terror gripping his chest. They watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the live feed of the EUR/USD currency pair ticked upward. Every fraction of a cent the euro gained against the dollar was a massive bleeding wound to the account. Because Julian had used such extreme leverage, the $50 million wasn't capital, it was merely collateral, and the collateral was evaporating by the second. "Close the position," Richard bellowed, slamming his fist onto the table, rattling the fine china. "Liquidate it now. Take the loss before it wipes the whole account." "I'm trying!" Victoria screamed, her fingers flying desperately across the trackpad. She clicked the bright red close position button. A pop-up window appeared on the screen. Transaction denied. Smart contract lock active. Liquidation requires secondary cryptographic authorization. "It's locked," Victoria gasped, tears of pure panic springing to her eyes. Julian locked the execution protocols. "We can't close the trade. We can just watch it." "Call the broker. Call the bank in Cyprus," Richard yelled, standing up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. "Dad, look at the margin requirement," Victoria shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the bottom corner of the screen. "Because you signed the global transfer of liability, the broker consolidated the accounts. The margin call isn't just draining the $50 million. Richard leaned over the table, his eyes widening in a horror so profound it bordered on madness. Clara hadn't just handed them the trap. She had actively chained their own wealth to the bomb. Before initiating the transfer, Clara and Leo had used Julian's administrator access to link the offshore trading account directly to Richard's private wealth trusts and Victoria's corporate banking accounts as secondary collateral. On the screen, a massive red banner flashed. Margin call executed. The euro had hit the liquidation threshold. The system, desperate to cover the $5 billion leveraged loss, instantly vaporized the initial $50 million. But it wasn't enough. The automated clearinghouse immediately reached into the linked secondary accounts to cover the negative balance. Right before their eyes, Richard Mitchell watched his life's work disappear. The screen showed his private trusts, his retirement portfolios, and the family's emergency funds draining in real time. Millions of dollars, clean money, dirty money, generational wealth, being sucked into the digital void to pay off a catastrophic debt they had unknowingly volunteered to absorb. "No, no, no, no," Richard whimpered, his imposing authoritative facade completely collapsing. He clawed at his chest, struggling to breathe. "My firm!" Victoria screamed hysterically, watching the operating capital of her PR agency plummet to zero. "It's all gone. Every penny is gone." In less than 3 minutes, the Mitchell family went from possessing a $50 million criminal empire to being utterly, catastrophically bankrupt. They were in the red for millions. But the financial ruin was only the first wave of the tsunami Clara had unleashed. A heavy silence fell over the dining room, broken only by Victoria's ragged, hysterical sobbing and Margaret's confused questions from the hallway. Then Richard's cell phone rang. It wasn't a standard ringtone. It was a harsh, vibrating trill. Richard picked up this phone with a shaking hand. The caller ID was a string of zeros. "Hello?" Richard croaked. "Mr. Mitchell," the thick, emotionless voice of Marcus Thorne echoed through the speaker. "I have just received a very interesting email containing a notarized power of attorney. It appears you and your daughter are now the sole legal owners of my $50 million. "Mr. Thorne, please, you have to understand," Richard pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "It was a trap. Julian lost the money in the market. The account is wiped out." "I do not care about the market, Mr. Mitchell," Thorne replied softly. "I do not care about margin calls or bad trades. I care that you legally assumed the debt of my organization. Since you do not have my money, I will be taking my payment in flesh. My men are currently pulling into your neighborhood. Do not bother calling the police. They cannot save you from what happens next." The line clicked dead. Richard dropped the phone. It shattered against the hardwood floor. He looked at Victoria, his face a mask of primal, animalistic terror. "Thorne's men are coming. We have to run. Now." 30 miles away, in the quiet, sunlit booth of an unassuming roadside diner, Clara sat across from Leo. She was wearing a simple cashmere sweater, her dark hair pulled back, sipping a cup of black coffee. She looked perfectly rested, completely serene. Leo was staring at his laptop, watching the live data feeds. The margin call executed flawlessly, Leo reported, looking up at Clara with a mix of awe and profound respect. The offshore accounts are liquidated. Richard's personal trusts are drained. They have absolutely nothing left. Clara took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. And the secondary protocol? Leo nodded, hitting a single key on his laptop. Emails dispatched. The encrypted audio files of Julian confessing to my mother's murder, the wire transfer receipts proving Victoria paid the mechanic, and the entire 10-year ledger of Richard's money laundering activities have just been delivered to the director of the FBI in Chicago, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the local homicide detectives. Clara set her coffee cup down. She looked out the window of the diner, watching the morning traffic roll by. She felt a profound, heavy weight lift off her shoulders. For 5 years, she had lived in a gilded cage built on lies and blood. Today, she was completely free. Julian didn't just leave us the trap, did he? Clara asked softly. Leo smiled, a genuine youthful smile breaking through the shadows that had haunted him since his father's death. No, he knew the offshore accounts were poisoned. He knew the feds and the cartel would tear them apart. So he built a lifeboat. Leo brought up a completely different interface. It was a secure portal for a private, anonymous educational trust based in Liechtenstein, a jurisdiction notorious for its impenetrable banking privacy laws. Julian began funneling clean, legitimate investment returns into this trust the day I was born, Leo explained. It was never touched by cartel money. It's completely legal, fully taxed, and totally invisible to anyone looking at his domestic assets. It contains $12 million. The sole beneficiary is me, and the sole irrevocable executor is you. Clara stared at the screen. $12 million. It wasn't cartel money. It wasn't blood money. It was the only honest thing Julian had ever done, a desperate attempt to ensure that if his dark world finally collapsed, his son and his innocent wife would have a way out. We need to go, Leo, Clara said, standing up and throwing a $20 bill onto the table. I hear Colorado is beautiful this time of year. Back at the Lake Forest estate, the scene had descended into absolute madness. Richard was frantically stuffing handfuls of jewelry and whatever cash he could find in the safe into a duffel bag. Victoria was screaming at her mother, dragging Margaret toward the back door. "Leave the orchids, you stupid woman!" Victoria shrieked, yanking her mother by the arm. "Cartel hitmen are coming to kill us!" They burst out of the back doors, sprinting across the manicured patio toward the garage. But as Richard hit the button to raise the heavy garage doors, a sound echoed through the crisp morning air that froze the blood in their veins. The rhythmic, heavy thumping of helicopter rotors. Richard looked up to see a dark blue helicopter with bold yellow letters painted on the side, FBI, hovering low over the tree line. At the exact same moment, the heavy wrought iron gates at the front of the estate were violently rammed open by a pair of armored black SUVs. But it wasn't Marcus Thorne's cartel hitmen. It was a SWAT team. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles, tactical rifles raised, moving with terrifying precision. "FBI, get on the ground! Show me your hands!" The voice boomed through a megaphone, echoing across the sprawling lawns. Richard dropped the duffel bag. The diamonds and watches spilled out onto the concrete, glittering uselessly in the sun. He fell to his knees, raising his trembling hands in the air. Victoria didn't surrender. Panic overriding her sanity, she turned and tried to sprint toward the woods bordering the property. She made it less than 20 yards before 2 tactical agents tackled her to the ground, driving her face roughly into the pristine, manicured grass she prized so highly. "Get your hands off me!" Victoria screamed, spitting dirt, her designer silk blouse tearing at the shoulder. "I'm a victim. My sister did this. Clara did this. Victoria Mitchell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and money laundering," an agent said coldly, violently wrenching her arms behind her back and slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. As they hauled Victoria to her feet, she looked over at her father, who was currently being pinned against the hood of a federal cruiser, a terrified, weeping mess. The beautiful, impenetrable family facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. "Tell them, Dad," Victoria shrieked hysterically, thrashing against the agent's grip. "Tell them it was your idea to cut the brake lines. You made me pay the mechanic. Tell them you killed Sarah." "Shut up, you stupid bitch!" Richard roared back, his face purple with rage and fear, spitting venom at his own daughter. "You pulled the trigger. You wanted the money. It was you." Margaret stood paralyzed on the patio, watching her husband and daughter violently turn on each other, tearing at each other's throats to save themselves. As an agent gently but firmly placed handcuffs on her wrists, she began to sob uncontrollably, mourning not her family, but the loss of her country club memberships and her perfect, insulated life. From the tree line, parked discreetly on a side street, a sleek black sedan watched the chaotic raid unfold. Inside the car, 2 men in dark suits sat in silence. One of them held a cell phone to his ear. "Mr. Thorne," the man said quietly, "the feds beat us to it. It's a massive raid. IRS, FBI, local homicide. They're taking the whole family into custody." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Let the government have them," Marcus Thorne finally replied, his voice chillingly calm. "Federal prison is a very dangerous place for people who owe me money. They will not survive their sentences. Have our people on the inside make the arrangements." The black sedan quietly slipped into gear and drove away, disappearing into this morning traffic, leaving the Mitchell family to the absolute devastation of their own making. 6 months later, the air in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado was thin, crisp, and smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. Far away from the suffocating socialite circles of Chicago, nestled on a sprawling 20-acre plot of private woodland, sat a magnificent modern timber frame cabin. Inside, the fire crackled warmly in the massive stone hearth. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the snow-capped peaks. Clara Mitchell, 32 years old and radiating a quiet, grounded strength, sat in a plush leather armchair by the fire. She wore thick wool socks, comfortable leggings, and an oversized cashmere sweater. Her dark hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders. She looked younger, lighter, and infinitely more dangerous than she ever had in her designer gowns. She held a steaming mug of dark roast coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. On the screen, a news article from the Chicago Tribune dominated the headlines. "Prominent Lake Forest family pleads guilty to murder for hire and money laundering. Richard and Victoria Mitchell sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Margaret Mitchell receives 15 years as an accessory." Federal prosecutors described the case as a breathtaking display of familial greed and sociopathy. Clara read the headline with a completely neutral expression. She felt no pity. She felt no remorse. She simply felt the satisfying, cold finality of justice served. She tapped the screen, closing the article forever. Outside the window, a figure moved through the deep snow. It was Leo. He was wearing a heavy flannel jacket and a thick beanie, swinging an axe with practiced ease, splitting firewood for the evening. He looked strong, healthy, and finally unburdened by the ghosts of his parents' past. He had started taking online courses in architecture, building a new life with the clean money his father had desperately hidden away for him. Clara watched him for a moment, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips. They weren't a traditional family, but they were survivors. They had walked through the fire built by the people who were supposed to love them, and they had emerged on the other side, unburned. Clara set her coffee mug down, picked up a thick novel, and leaned back into the warmth of the chair. She didn't have to look over her shoulder. She didn't have to pretend. She was the architect of her own life now, and the foundation she had built was solid rock. The snow continued to fall, silently burying the past, leaving nothing but a pure white slate for the future.